Hello, I'm Jonah Roos, curator in charge of the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art here at the Metropolitan, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you today to the Armand Brunswick Distinguished Lectures in Archaeology of the Raymond and Beverly Sackler Foundation. These lectures, held every 3 years, were founded by Raymond and Beverly Sackler, great benefactors of the Metropolitan Museum and dedicated supporters of the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art. And I speak not only of the grand projects that bear their names, such as the Raymond and Beverly Sackler Gallery of Assyrian Art, but also the lesser-known displays of support, such as the Raymond and Beverly Sackler Long-Term Loan Fund, which has enabled us to bring such great works of art from the Near East and Central Asia as, for instance, the Nisa Raita, which you might know about. And there are also many other expressions of their commitment. One most memorable event being the support that they offered us for the Raymond and Beverly Sackler Symposium, Beyond Babylon, Art, Trade, and Diplomacy in the Second Millennium BC. That was a highlight of the program for our last major exhibition. And I'm happy to mention that the publication of those papers is underway and will come out next year. Of course, there are so many other ways that the Sacklers have enriched the work of our department, and today I'm very happy to have the opportunity to publicly thank them for this. The Sacklers established this lecture series. The Sacklers established this lecture series to honor and now memorialize their friend of 50 years, Armand Brunswick. Armand Brunswick's talents in the arts, particularly as a fashion designer, led him to achieve great success in the textile industry. And these qualities also led to a fascination with art history and archaeology. How interested he would have been to learn more about the wonders of Babylon from John Curtis, our speaker today. When I spoke to Raymond and Beverly Sackler and proposed the idea to have John Curtis speak and to dedicate this lecture also to the memory of Donny George, a great hero in the struggle to preserve Iraqi antiquities, they could not have been more enthusiastic. John Curtis has recently written a moving and also comprehensive obituary for Donny George in the recent volume of the journal Iraq. But here I would just like to say a few words about this extraordinary man whose quest to recover the stolen heritage of Iraq and protect what survived is seared into our memory. Donny George Youkhanna was born into a family of Assyrian Christians whose roots in Mesopotamia reached back into ancient times. He began his career at the Iraq Museum in 1976 after receiving a bachelor's degree from the University of Baghdad, where he also eventually got his PhD. He became field director for the restoration of Babylon in 1966 and 7 and conducted archaeological investigations of the East Wall of Nineveh in 1988 and rescue excavations in the following year. A professor at Baghdad University and the College of Babylon, he became Director General of Research and Studies at the Iraq State Board of Antiquities and Heritage and eventually its chairman. In 2003, Donny George was also appointed Director General of the Iraq Museum. But 3 years later, he was forced to leave his homeland and found refuge, along with his family, at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, where he became a visiting professor in the Department of Anthropology. We were proud to call him a friend of our department, and he was an active member of our visiting committee. We thought that this lecture would be a fitting tribute both to Donny's memory and to Armand Brunswick. We could not have a better speaker, for John Curtis has been one of the most active people dedicated to preserving the heritage of ancient Iraq, and was a friend to Donny and had the fortune also to meet Armand Brunswick. John Curtis has been affiliated with the British Museum since 1971 after completing his doctorate on late Assyrian metalwork at the Institute of Archaeology, University of London, and then spending 2 years in Baghdad as a fellow of the British School of Archaeology in Iraq. He was appointed keeper of Western Asiatic Antiquities in 1989, and since October 2011 has become keeper for special Middle East projects. Dr. Curtis is chiefly interested in Mesopotamia, Iran, and the Caucasus in the Iron Age of the first millennium BC, and he is the author or editor of 17 books and more than 100 articles on these subjects. He is an active archaeologist who between 1983 and 1989 directed excavations on behalf of the British Museum at 8 different sites in Iraq, including the Assyrian cities of Nimrud and Balawat. After he became keeper, he supervised the installation of 6 new ancient Near Eastern galleries at the British Museum, 5 of them sponsored by Raymond and Beverly Sackler. He curated the traveling exhibition Art and Empire, Treasures from Assyria in the British Museum, that had been sent to many different venues around the world after its inauguration right here at the Metropolitan Museum in 1995. In 2005 and 2006, he organized the special exhibition Forgotten Empire, The World of Ancient Persia at the British Museum, and then arranged for the display of the famous Cyrus cylinder in Tehran. Since 2003, Dr. Curtis has been much involved in efforts to try and safeguard Iraqi cultural heritage. He is a member of UNESCO's International Iraq Committee and its Babylon Committee, and UNESCO has published in full his report on damage to Babylon, prepared in December 2004. To celebrate his accomplishments, John Curtis was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 2003 and awarded the Order of the British Empire in 2006, just a few of his numerous accolades. We had the pleasure of hearing John Curtis lecture to us during the Armand Brunswick lecture of 1993 on excavating in Mesopotamia from Alexander to Kulagu Khan. And now, after 18 years, far too long, we have found the perfect opportunity to entice him to join us once again to tell us about Babylon, a wonder of the ancient world. Please welcome our dear colleague, John Curtis.
Thank you very much indeed, Joan, for those very kind words. Well, first of all, I'd like, of course, to thank Jonah Rose and Raymond and Beverly Sackler for inviting me to give this lecture. It's a great pleasure to be here again in New York, and an honor to be giving this lecture dedicated to Armand Brunswick, who sadly passed away in 1996. But I did have the privilege of meeting him in 1993, when, as you heard, I gave another lecture in this series. Well, my subject this evening is Babylon, but before launching into the lecture, I'd like to pay tribute to Raymond and Beverly Sackler, who've done so much to promote interest in the ancient Near East in many different parts of the world, particularly, as far as I'm concerned, in the British Museum, where they've sponsored a Sackler wing of galleries dedicated to the ancient Near East and Egypt, and an annual scholarship. The lecture is also, as you've heard, in honor of my good friend, Dr. Donny George, on the left there, who did so much to promote the cultural heritage of Iraq. And he's actually pictured here at Babylon in 2003. Babylon is one of the most famous sites in the ancient world, perhaps even the most famous. It's situated in southern Iraq, southern Mesopotamia, or Iraq, as it now is, just down there, on the banks of the river Euphrates. Now, Mesopotamia is the home to three great civilizations: Sumer in the south, Babylonia in the middle, and Assyria in the north. And Babylon was the most important city in Babylonia, and for several thousand years was an important political capital, as well as being a flourishing center of culture and civilization. These are views of the site as it appears today. Amongst the achievements of Babylonian civilization are great works of literature, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, huge advances in mathematics, which gave the world the sexagesimal system, which is why hours and minutes are divided into 60ths, detailed astronomical observations, and a surprising understanding of medical conditions, which led sometimes to their successful treatment. There was even a rudimentary understanding of geography and topography, as witnessed the Babylonian map of the world on a cuneiform clay tablet, which puts Babylon at the heart of the universe. Babylon continues to intrigue. Small wonder, then, that in recent years there have been no fewer than 4 major exhibitions about Babylon, one in the Louvre in Paris, one in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, one in the British Museum, and a 4th here in the Metropolitan Museum in 2009. Although the Metropolitan Museum, brilliantly curated by Jonah Rose, was more wide-ranging than the others, exploring Babylonian civilization well beyond the narrow confines of Babylonia. The first question we need to address is why Babylon is so famous in the Western world. There are really 2 reasons for this. Firstly, there are extensive references to Babylon in the Bible, and secondly, there are the many descriptions of Babylon in the classical authors. To deal first with the references in the Bible, these are uniformly negative. This is almost certainly because in 597 BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem and deposed the Jewish king Jehoiakim. 10 years later, in 587 BC, there was a rebellion, after which Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the city and the temple and deported many of the inhabitants of Jerusalem to Babylon. Intriguingly, the accuracy of the biblical account of these events has been corroborated by a recent discovery in the British Museum. An Austrian scholar named Michael Ljosa has read on one of the many cuneiform tablets, clay tablets in the British Museum collection, the name of one of the officials who, according to the book of Jeremiah, accompanied Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon. So that's a rare and very interesting example of an independent source giving some corroboration to the biblical account. So it's the Babylonian captivity, then, that led to the jaundiced view of Babylon in the Bible. The best-known lament of the deported Jews is, of course, to be found in Psalm 137, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the words, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion." And it continues, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill." The psalm then predicts the destruction of Babylon, as do the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah. According to Isaiah, Babylon will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. She will never be inhabited or lived in through all the generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherd will rest his flocks there, but desert creatures will lie there. Jeremiah also prophesied that Babylon would be destroyed and laid waste, saying, "The Lord has stirred up the king of the Medes, because his purpose is to destroy Babylon. Babylon will be a heap of ruins, a haunt of jackals, an object of horror and scorn, a place where no one lives." We also read in the book of Daniel about the terrible fate that overtakes Nebuchadnezzar, here in the book of Daniel confused with Nabonidus, the Babylonian king Nabonidus, for failing to praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven. And it says, "He was driven away from people and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird." This was the description that inspired William Blake to produce his famous image of Nebuchadnezzar on the screen now. Like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Daniel also predicted the destruction of Babylon. During a banquet hosted by King Belshazzar, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the wall. Nobody could understand the writing except Daniel, who read Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, which he interpreted to mean that Belshazzar's kingdom was to be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And interestingly, my colleague Irving Finkel has recently suggested that this really ought to be read Mina, Mina, Shekel, Upasim. And minas and shekels are different types of coins, and the meaning would be that you go from a large one to a small one and you divide it up and you eventually come to nothing. In Revelation, the apocalyptic book of the 1st century AD, we read of Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth. So arose the legend of the whore of Babylon and the association with Babylon of everything in the world that was most wicked. Well, so much for the biblical accounts. The fullest account of Babylon in the classical authors is by the Greek author Herodotus, popularly known as the father of history. He describes the topography of the city in great detail. He says that it was square and that the city wall was wide enough for a 4-horse chariot to turn on. Within the walls there was the royal palace, a shrine where there is a great golden image of Zeus, presumably the temple of Marduk, and the sacred enclosure of Zeus. In the center of the enclosure, this is still the account of Herodotus, was a solid tower with 7 receding stages or towers above it, giving in all an 8-stepped pyramid. In the last tower, there was a great shrine containing a couch and a golden table, and this shrine was inhabited by just one native woman. Now, this building we know to have been a ziggurat, a staged temple tower, familiar from other sites in Mesopotamia and Iran. However, the ziggurat at Babylon no longer exists. Over many centuries, people have removed the mud bricks from which it was built. That was for their own local, to build their houses in the Babylon area and beyond, so that now the ziggurat is only represented by a depression in the ground. This is an aerial photograph of the ziggurat site, and you can see that just about everything has been taken away. But we are incidentally familiar with the bricks from which it was built. They're inscribed with the name of Nebuchadnezzar, and they must have been made in their millions, and they're now very common in museum collections, private collections, and so on. Herodotus' description of the ziggurat at Babylon, combined with biblical references to the Tower of Babel, inspired generations of European painters to represent this structure. The most famous depiction is by the Flemish artist Peter Bruegel the Elder, who in 1536 painted a Tower of Babel looking rather like the Colosseum at Rome. Another painting by an artist of the Flemish school again puts the tower in a thoroughly European setting. Well, now, thanks to detailed descriptions of the Etemenanki ziggurat contained on 2 cuneiform tablets, which give precise measurements and other information, it's possible to attempt a reconstruction which is probably quite close to the original. There have been several reconstructions, but I particularly like this one, which was produced for Professor Donald Wiseman's book on Nebuchadnezzar, and I think it does give a particularly good impression of what the Babylon ziggurat would have looked like originally. Oddly, Herodotus makes no mention at all of the hanging gardens for which Babylon is so famous. The earliest known description of them comes from the Greek historian Ctesias, who was physician to the Persian king Artaxerxes II. The original works of Ctesias are now lost, but they are preserved in other later authors, such as Diodorus of Sicily. He describes how a Babylonian king, presumably Nebuchadnezzar, built the gardens for a homesick Persian concubine to remind her of the mountains and sometimes lush vegetation of her homeland. The gardens were terraced, rising to a considerable height, and there was apparently an ingenious system of irrigation in which water was raised from the river Euphrates to the top of the gardens and then cascaded down the terraces. There's been much speculation about how this system worked, and the general consensus is that the water was raised by means of an Archimedes screw. Unfortunately, it's quite unclear whereabouts the hanging gardens were at Babylon, and there is now no trace of them. However, they must have been very impressive because they were regarded by later Greek authors as one of the 7 wonders of the world, together with the Great Pyramid at Giza, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, and the lighthouse at Alexandria. We come now to the real Babylon and its rediscovery in modern times. The first person to explore the ruins in a scientific manner was Claudius James Rich, who was the East India Company's resident in Baghdad. He visited the site in 1811 and 1818 and was able to make a quite accurate plan of the ruins. Rich was a brilliant Orientalist who died from cholera in Shiraz in Iran when he was just 34 years old. His extensive collection of manuscripts, antiquities, and coins was purchased by the British Museum, and it was the British Museum which made itself responsible for much of the excavation at Babylon during the 19th century. The work of Hormuz Rassam, seen here, between 1879 and 1882, was a glorified hunt for tablets, but Rassam did, as we shall see, find some very important pieces. Rassam had originally been Henry Layard's assistant at Nimrud and Nineveh. He was a native of Mosul in northern Iraq and was born into a Christian family there. Well, most of what we know about Babylon derives from the work of the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey, who worked at the site all the year round, braving summer temperatures of more than 50 degrees centigrade, for 18 years, from 1899 until 1917. He'd previously worked in Sicily, and during his time in Babylon, the Germans lived in an expedition house on the site, shown here in a watercolor by another brilliant German archaeologist, Walter Andre, who went on to dig at Ashur. And the work was finally only brought to a halt by the First World War. Before that, Koldewey had traced the lines of the walls and the position of the gates and showed that there was an inner town and an outer town. And he excavated a number of temples dedicated to deities including Ishtar, Ninmah, and Nabu. He excavated the so-called Summer Palace and the southern palace of Nebuchadnezzar, which is what you can see now on the screen after a certain amount of restoration in the 1990s. This is a glazed brick panel from the throne room of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, now in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, showing lions at the bottom, palm trees in the middle, and lotus flower designs around the edge. But Koldewey's main achievement was the excavation of the Ishtar Gate at the beginning of the processional way, seen here in this reconstruction painting. The gate had mostly collapsed in ancient times, so what Koldewey actually found in the upper levels were thousands of fragments of glazed brick. These were taken to Berlin and painstakingly put together so that the Ishtar Gate could be reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum. This is a view as it appears now in the Museum of Berlin, and of the figures shown in the glazed bricks on this gate, there are bulls and lions, as well as dragon or mushushu figures, of which I'll show you a picture later. The gate also went below the ancient ground level to a great depth, similarly decorated with bull, lion, and dragon figures, but here the figures were made of plain moulded bricks that were unglazed. Well, what do we know of the early history of Babylon? The first certain mention of the city is in the reign of the Akkadian king Shar-Kali-Shari in about 2300 BC, but from an archaeological point of view, nothing is known of Babylon in time until the time of the Neo-Babylonian kings in the 6th century BC. This is because the water table at Babylon is very high, owing to the proximity of the river Euphrates, and it's proved impossible to excavate the early levels at the site because they are, in effect, under water. But we know that in the 1500 years before the Neo-Babylonian period, Babylon was a preeminent center of great importance. So if it was possible to excavate the early levels, undoubtedly important things would be found. For example, Babylon was the capital or city of King Hammurabi, who reigned from 1792 to 1750 BC, famed for his law code. This famous stela, now in the Louvre Museum in Paris, was actually found at Susa in Iran, where it was taken in antiquity from a center in Babylonia, possibly even from Babylon itself. And this stela lists about 250 laws, mostly following the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth pattern. Another object of similar date, that is around 1750 BC, is a large terracotta plaque known as the Queen of the Night. And this shows a naked goddess with wings and talons for feet, who is flanked by owls. She's a goddess of the underworld, perhaps Ishtar, or more likely Eresh Kigal. And although unpronounced, this is the sort of thing that would have been familiar to inhabitants of Babylon. Well, we fast forward now to the Neo-Babylonian period, which may be reckoned to start in 612 BC. In that year, a Babylonian army joined forces with the Medes of Iran to attack and destroy the powerful state of Assyria in the north part of Mesopotamia. The main Assyrian cities, like Nimrud and Nineveh, were sacked and burnt, and the Babylonians took over the western part of the Assyrian Empire, while the Medes took over the eastern part. This meant that the Babylonians were now not only in charge of southern Mesopotamia, but also, in theory, of the whole of the ancient Near East, extending to the Mediterranean coast. This brought them into contact with ancient Israel, as we have seen, and there was also a lengthy siege of Tyre in Phoenicia, now in Lebanon. Nebuchadnezzar even waged war against faraway Egypt. Apart from his military activities, Nebuchadnezzar also embarked on a massive building program at Babylon, which we briefly described. Unfortunately for the Babylonians, the successors of Nebuchadnezzar entirely lacked his dynamism and vision, and the Neo-Babylonian dynasty held power for less than 100 years. The last of the Neo-Babylonian kings, Nabonidus, was not of the same caliber as Nebuchadnezzar. He seems to have alienated the Babylonians by elevating the moon god Sin to a higher position than the national god of Babylon, Marduk, and he spent a long part of his reign in Tamar in Arabia. And his incompetence may have been an element in the disaster that was about to overtake the Babylonians, but there were probably other economic, political, and social factors at play. However that may be, the Achaemenid king Cyrus the Great, who had recently proclaimed himself king over the united Medes and Persians, entered Babylon, apparently without a struggle, in 539 BC, and captured not just the city, but effectively the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And his conquest of Babylon is described in a document known as the Cyrus Cylinder, now in the British Museum, that's sometimes called the First Bill of Human Rights, because it ostensibly differs from contemporary documents in two ways. First, it says that the statues of gods belonging to defeated peoples that had been brought to Babylon could be returned to the temples from which they'd been seized, which is taken to mean that Cyrus was allowing freedom of religious expression. Secondly, the document says that deported peoples could return to their homelands. Although the Jews are not mentioned by name, it is thought to be at this time that the deportees returned to Jerusalem and started work on building the second temple. This would explain why Cyrus is so well regarded in the Bible, in the books of Isaiah and Ezekiel. A recent discovery in the British Museum of two fragments of cuneiform tablet with parts of the same text as the Cyrus Cylinder shows that the document was not unique and may have been widely promulgated. This is one fragment on the left, and this is the front and back of the second fragment. The tablet fragments with the Cyrus Cylinder were actually exhibited in the National Museum in Tehran between September 2010 and April 2011 in an effort to maintain dialogue with Iranian colleagues on a cultural level. Other objects from Babylon dating from the Persian period are fragments of a stela of Darius the Great and a glazed brick from his palace. Then, in due course, Babylon was captured by Alexander in 331 BC. He built a theatre in Babylon and shortly afterwards died there. After the Hellenistic period, Babylon continued to be occupied into Parthian times, but thereafter occupation effectively ceased, thus fulfilling the biblical prophecies. As we've seen, in the course of the German excavations directed by Koldewey, much was discovered about the topography of ancient Babylon. However, the remains of mud brick buildings are notoriously difficult to preserve, and once they're exposed to the elements, they rapidly deteriorate. The disintegrating mud brick buildings, plus the trenches and spoil tips that are a feature of all major excavations, combined to present a site that was difficult to interpret and visually unappealing, and this is reflected in these early views of the ruins. There were, it is true, some redeeming features. The foundations of the Ishtar Gate with unglazed moulded bricks were still visible, and the Lion of Babylon was a well-known and popular attraction to visitors to the site. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon continued to figure largely in the public imagination. All of these features, combined with the fame and notoriety of ancient Babylon, were enough to ensure that after the state of Iraq came into existence in 1920, Babylon became one of the iconic symbols of the new state. Thus, the Lion of Babylon was shown on various Iraqi stamps from 1941 onwards. In an effort to improve the quality of the visitor experience at Babylon in the 1960s, this half-size replica of the above-ground part of the Ishtar Gate was built. But in spite of these welcome innovations at the site itself, Babylon still remained a disappointment for most visitors. It wasn't surprising then that Saddam Hussein attempted to turn Babylon into a symbol in keeping with his nationalistic ambitions for the Republic of Iraq. Accordingly, the archaeological restoration of Babylon project started in 1978, and even the Iraq-Iran war, which began in September 1980, was not allowed to interfere with, hold up the plans for the reconstruction, which continued unabated. And as early as 1982, a set of 7 coins was issued commemorating the restoration project and bearing images of Babylon. And these show the Ishtar Gate, the Lion of Babylon, the Stele of Hammurabi, and a reconstruction of the Babylonian ziggurat. Hand in hand with the restoration project was a large amount of excavation work undertaken by Iraqi archaeologists, and this restoration project was on a vast scale and involved the creation of 3 artificial lakes on the site. We can see some of them here and down there. And the formation of 3 gigantic artificial mounds. This is one of the lakes on the site, and these are aerial views showing the mounds and the lakes and the reconstructed palace of Nebuchadnezzar. On top of one of the mounds, overlooking the site, a palace was built for Saddam himself. It was sumptuously decorated. Witness this painted ceiling. And also in the course of the restoration project, the southern palace of Nebuchadnezzar, with 5 large courtyards and about 250 rooms, was largely rebuilt. And the main entrance to the palace was restored to a height of 30 meters, and many of the walls rebuilt to a height of about 20 meters. And for this reconstruction, new bricks were laid on top of bricks surviving from the original structure. Many of the original bricks have been stamped with inscriptions in Babylonian cuneiform of Nebuchadnezzar, and Saddam continued this ancient practice by having many of the new bricks stamped with his own inscription in Arabic, reading in translation in the era of Saddam, protector of Iraq, who rebuilt the royal palace. There was further restoration work on other buildings, and the Lion of Babylon was given pride of place in open ground adjacent to the southern palace. Well, the first phase of this reconstruction project was mostly finished in time for the first Babylon International Festival in 1987, which was a lavish event lasting for a month. And in the promotional literature issued by the festival committee, Saddam was compared with great figures from Babylonian history like Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar, and you can see here a picture of a medal that was issued showing his profiled portrait overlapping that of Nebuchadnezzar. And after that, festivals were held nearly every year up until 2002, sometimes accompanied by an archaeological conference, and as late as 2001, this 25 dinar banknote was issued, showing on the reverse the Ishtar Gate and the Lion of Babylon. Well, clearly, much of the so-called restoration work undertaken at Babylon during the time of Saddam Hussein went far beyond what is normally acceptable, and it's been roundly condemned by conservation groups. I think we can say that in the time of Saddam, the treatment of Babylon was cavalier, to say the least. But unfortunately, it was not treated with very much greater respect by coalition troops after 2003. To start with, there were few problems with just the gift shop being looted and burnt out during the war. Problems began in September 2003 when Babylon became Camp Alpha for the Multinational Division Central South. And you can see on this slide some of the military installations here next to the restored palace of Nebuchadnezzar. Here are some more views of the military activity at the site. So from September onwards, the camp escalated rapidly so that at its greatest extent it covered 150 hectares in size and was home to 2,000 troops. And this camp was established right in the heart of ancient Babylon, as you can see here, straddling the north part of the inner city and including many of the famous landmarks of ancient Babylon, like the Ishtar Gate and the Lion of Babylon, the Palace of Nebuchadnezzar, and so on. This is actually one of the a military map showing the extent of the camp. Well, during the summer of 2004, as news spread about the scale of the military activity at Babylon, there was growing unease amongst the international community, an increasing number of complaints on the World Wide Web. And foremost amongst those drawing attention to the damage at Babylon was Professor Zainab Bahrani of the University of Columbia here in New York. Consequently, at the end of December 2004, the coalition authorities took the decision to close down the camp and hand control of Babylon back to the Iraqi side. And in preparation for this handover, Polish archaeologists working with the Polish forces who were then stationed in Camp Alpha prepared a lengthy document which is a thorough survey describing the condition of the site and the surviving and restored monuments. It's an extremely useful piece of work and an important source of reference, but what the report doesn't do is detail the damage caused between March 2003 and December 2004. Consequently, I was asked by the then Iraqi Minister of Culture to attend the handover ceremony in December 2004 and prepare an independent report on damage caused during the military occupation. And what you can see here is the people who were assembled there for that inspection. And I would like to take this opportunity to say that on this occasion and every other occasion that I've been in Iraq, American troops have been unfailingly helpful and cooperative. Well, during the course of this inspection, we were shown 11 trenches dug by the military, often through previously undisturbed archaeological deposits, and the longest of these, you can see on the left, was about 170 meters long, and it was just beyond the line of barbed wire marking the southern boundary of the camp, quite close to the site of the ancient ziggurat Etemenanki. And the purpose of the ditch was apparently defensive, to prevent vehicles from driving right up to the wire. And thrown up on the sides of the trench were piles of earth containing at least one pottery vessel, bones, and fragments of brick with inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar. Then there were about 14 cuttings, areas where topsoil had been removed by a shovel, sometimes to a depth of 6 meters, and this is one of the largest of those areas. The next problem was the so-called fuel farm, an area where there had been gigantic tanks of fuel, and it was here, of course, that military vehicles came to refuel, and inevitably there was considerable spillage, with the result that the fuel will have worked its way down into the ground, contaminating the archaeological deposits beneath. Before the war, some of the areas of the site had been flattened and covered with gravel, including an area for helicopters to land. But during the construction of the camp, the helipad was greatly enlarged, and there was an increase in the amount of flattened area elsewhere to provide bases for the temporary structures needed for the military camp. Then, in many places around the camp, but particularly in the vicinity of the gates, there were still, in December 2004, large numbers of HESCO containers. These are large wire mesh cages lined with fabric which are filled with earth. They serve the same purpose as sandbags, but are much bigger. And the earth in many of these HESCO containers is mixed with potsherds, bones, and even fragments of inscribed brick, showing that the earth came from either undisturbed or redeposited archaeological contexts. Another problem related to the driving of heavy military vehicles around the site, and in many places, wheel marks and signs of surface damage were visible, but it's not usually clear how much damage this might have caused to the fragile archaeological deposits beneath. But in one instance, it was obvious. This was in the north part of the famous processional way, which you can see on the right, where original paving slabs had been broken by military vehicles being driven along the street. Arguably, the most serious damage of all, though, occurred in the Ishtar Gate. By December 2004, 9 of the dragon figures had been damaged, probably by a souvenir hunter trying to remove molded bricks as mementos. I'd like to say, though, that the news is not all bad, and indeed there are grounds for optimism. For example, it had been reported that there were more than 100 foxholes or firing positions that had been dug by Iraqi soldiers in the run-up to the coalition advance. But during a UNESCO visit in February 2008, I was able to establish with certainty that there were actually only 9 of these firing holes. At the same time, we visited the so-called Summer Palace of Nebuchadnezzar and found the mound to be in good condition, with no signs of looting or damage during or after the war. Another encouraging development is that in recognition of the importance of the site, the US State Department has made generous grants to the World Monuments Fund to draw up, in collaboration with the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, a management and conservation plan for Babylon. This is an ambitious project that is being ably directed by Dr. Jeff Allen, and I'd like to thank him for very kindly supplying me with a variety of images, from which I've selected a few to give you some idea of the range of the work. In a very responsible fashion, the World Monuments Fund has recognized that before remedial work or excavation work can be undertaken, the priority at Babylon is to produce a site management plan. And as part of this, various surveys need to be undertaken. This, for example, is a proposed traffic and circulation plan, and this is a plan showing land ownership in and around the site. As you might imagine, this is a very complicated matter, but it's absolutely essential to establish who owns what at Babylon before the work can proceed smoothly. Another study is of biodiversity and so on. Well, all this is very time-consuming, but very essential work, particularly if the application to make Babylon a World Heritage Site is to be successful. The World Monuments Fund has also started to do conservation work on some of the ancient buildings which have been reconstructed in modern times. And in nearly all cases, there's a lot of evidence of deterioration resulting from neglect and lack of maintenance, which in some cases goes back even as far as 1980. This is my photograph of the Ishtar Temple in 2008, and you can see that there's very bad crack in the wall. And this is conservation work being undertaken by the World Monuments Fund. These are very welcome initiatives, but the scale of the problem shouldn't be underestimated. In the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, for example, restored in the time of Saddam, there's a problem with rising damp that is going to tax the ingenuity of the world's very best civil engineers. And you can see on the right-hand side how the pavement has buckled because of underfloor water. I want to finish, though, on a positive note. As we've seen, the history of Babylon is long and complex, and the city has gone through many changes of fortune. Above all, though, we must remember that it was regarded by the ancients as one of the seven wonders of the world, or at least the Hanging Gardens were. Still today, it has the capacity to fascinate, and it's one of the most remarkable sites in the ancient world. Let us hope that it will soon be inscribed on the list of World Heritage Sites, and I have no doubt that in due course it will become one of the most visited sites in the Middle East. Thank you very much for your attention.